9, 12, 10, 28, 2, 23.
This is Deep State Radio.
Hello and welcome to the Thursday edition of Deep State Radio. I am not David Rothkopf, which will come as a shock to our longtime listeners. I am Riley Fessler, one of our producers, but David is now sick. He's taken the sickness from me, very selflessly of him. But nonetheless, we will endure. I am joined by Minnah Stein, my co-host for today. And we are joined by a wonderful guest, John Della Volpe, who is the director of polling at the Harvard Kennedy School Institute of Politics, where he has led research on American youth since 2000. And he is also the author of Fight, How Gen Z is Channeling Their Fear and Passion to Save America. John, thank you so much for joining us.
It's great to be with you guys. Great to be with you. Glad you're feeling better, Riley.
Yeah, I was sick this morning, and now David has fallen ill. So something is clearly going around here at Deep State Radio, despite the fact that we don't work in the same building. So who knows? But we are very thankful to have you join us. It's taken up a lot of headlines. Gen Z, as a voting bloc of this election, I think it's no secret that the Harris campaign has certainly made an effort to win over young voters. And I guess for the first question, I kind of want to start generally. You studied Gen Z as a voting bloc for quite some time. What is it about Gen Z that makes them kind of a unique voting bloc? Why are they so important to get? And, what are some of the challenges in reaching them?
Sure. Thanks, Riley. Yeah, I've been studying young voters for about half my life, for, almost 25 years or so. And first, was able to study like the entire millennial generation, and now the last handful of years, kind of Gen Z. And there are a few things I think that make Gen Z unique. The first of which is that, these were young people born 1997 to 2012, roughly 70 million young Americans. They don't have a living memory of 9/11. Instead, their first memories are often some combination of the Great Recession, school shootings, red alert school shooter drills, fentanyl, opioids, climate concerns, obviously George Floyd murder, and COVID. This is a generation that I argue in the book has dealt with more chaos more quickly than any other generation before neuroscience tells us that the human brain is actually mature at the age of 25. Despite all of that, and despite not seeing America, I argue, at our best for an extended period of time, this is a generation that seems committed to changing the systemic challenges that they and we all face through voting. This is a generation that when they turned from adolescents to 20 somethings in 2018, they voted at record numbers. This is a group that voted at roughly twice the level that their parents and their grandparents voted at when they were that same age group. We saw similar record level participation turnout in the 2020 election. And without Gen Z and younger voters under 30, younger millennials would be included, it's a different place. Pretty clear that Donald Trump would be president today if not for the role that Gen Z played. Again, not only record turnout, but also basically hitting the 60% mark in a 20-point margin for Biden over Trump in 2020. Those numbers, the combination of those two factors, were responsible, and this is what's relevant today, they were responsible for flipping 5 states from red to blue. For Democrats to win back the 3 blue wall states of Pennsylvania, Wisconsin, Michigan, and also Georgia and Arizona, the Sun Belt. So that's kind of the history. That's why it matters. And we'll see what happens. It's certainly kind of a more complicated picture today than it was 4 years ago, as it is with most every other subgroup of the electorate.
Everything that we've been reading points to the fact that young people have been headed to register to vote, that lots and lots of young people have registered, and that is very hopeful in terms of Kamala Harris's win in this upcoming election. Do you think that young people's increased voter registration is something that has been reflected in this recent election polling, or do you think that young people's registration is not being reflected? Do you think they're being underestimated in polling, and that young people voting will be part of that hidden Kamala Harris vote?
That's it's an excellent question, and it really kind of depends, I think, upon on the pollster. A lot of pollsters who are working off of a voter file that might have been updated several months ago could be missing that significant portion of newly registered folks who certainly by a significant margin favor Harris. So I do think there could be some underrepresentation there. I also may not think that there could be some underrepresentation in other places as well. That over the last 2 or 3 election cycles, it's been pretty consistent that 18 to 29-year-old voters have represented 16, 17% of all votes cast. And what I see in some of the A-plus pollsters out there, the media polls, rather than having 16, 17, even 15% of the sample reflected of 18 to 29-year-olds, I see 12%. The New York Times national survey had 12% of its survey of voters under 18 to 29. If you bump that number up to 16%, which is where it's been the last couple of elections, we'll see, adds about a point to Kamala Harris, to the overall race. It takes it, from 4 to almost 5 points. So there are a lot of ways in which polls may or may not accurately reflect young voters. But I think the overarching point is from the survey that we conducted at the Harvard IOP in the springtime to today, we see higher levels of enthusiasm about voting, of people saying they're likely to vote, and most all of that is driven from Democrats. In fact, relative to the March and April survey, we see that the number of Republicans actually decreased who say they're likely to vote. It went from 64 to 60%, whereas Democrats went from 66 to 74%. So again, polling, it's complicated. Polling young people is complicated. The big national polls still have a fairly significant margin of error with younger people, but those are some of the factors that I think we need to consider.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and along those lines, I think back to kind of 2016, 2020 with Bernie Sanders and, how much young people really were passionate about him. But, come the election, those votes didn't really materialize in the same way that we kind of expected them to based on enthusiasm online, what we were seeing from different kind of communities. And I guess my question is the youth vote, specifically Gen Z, more volatile than other groups? Is there something about Gen Z that means, their representation online or in discourse is perhaps greater than their actual voter turnout? And if that's the case, why is that?
Well, I think the Sanders examples are important for a number of reasons. But importantly, those are primary elections, and young people in 2020, I was surprised. I'm trying to think. I was surprised at the degree to which turnout was relatively modest relative to previous cycles. I spent some time in my book kind of exploring this, and I think that the Sanders folks did a good job organizing, but there were so many candidates. A lot of young people sometimes felt overwhelmed by it and wanted to feel really comfortable with their candidate before going out and endorsing and supporting and voting for someone, which was difficult for a lot of young people to do. And my sense is a lot of folks just didn't participate in the primary, wanted the primary to take care of itself, and then they would overwhelmingly support whoever the nominee was. And that's what we saw with Joe Biden. He did as well as anyone this century, including Obama. He got 60% of the vote, just like Obama did in 2012. But it is clearly volatile. It's clearly something you cannot take for granted. Some of the best predictors, Riley, of that I see regarding whether or not young people are going to vote is their kind of attitude, and do they believe that voting can make a tangible difference? And the degree to which people agree with that, we see higher likelihood to vote. That's what we've been seeing earlier this year. I'm cautiously optimistic that will continue. But again, one of the biggest mistakes that especially Democrats make is taking elements of this for granted. And when you talk about volatility, I think you have to talk about this story of this emerging gender gap that we're seeing with younger people, which isn't something that really was on the radar 4 years ago, 5 years ago. And what was definitely not on my radar a year ago was some polling I did this summer outside of Harvard, where Donald Trump was leading Joe Biden in the battleground states, right? So can't take it for granted. Always have to start with checking the attitudes of young people in terms of efficacy of politics in government. That's always the place to start political conversations. But then we constantly have to be measuring to see the degree to which they feel satisfied and connected to the Democratic Party. Otherwise, there are opportunities for people like Donald Trump to make significant inroads.
Yeah, and just to follow up really quickly, one of the areas we've heard about in recent weeks is religiosity among young people. Specifically, we've seen for the first time ever this flip where young men are more likely to be religious than young women among Gen Z. How do you see that affecting both this election dynamic and future if this trend continues?
Well, that's a question, right? Is this an episode, Riley, or is this a trend, right? And we're seeing a significant number, 10, 15% increase in Donald Trump's vote with younger men. That is kind of connected, I think, and with this increasing level of religiosity, increasing sense of that kind of yearning for that traditional trad lifestyle. You can see that reflected in not just party ID, which is a net change of 20 points in 4 years. Republicans are up 9, 10. Democrats are down 9 or 10 among younger men. But you can also see this reflected in attitudes that align with the MAGA element of the Republican Party. They're less likely to believe that government should be investing significantly in climate change. They are more likely to question free trade and other things. And it's something to take seriously and to for me to begin to kind of understand what some of those underlying drivers and values are that are leading young men in that direction.
I definitely think that I'm not somebody that you should be asking about volatility in youth voting. My 18th birthday was voter registration themed, and I got all of my friends to register to vote, and I gave them voter registration information so they could get their friends to vote. So I'm definitely not somebody who should be polled on this issue because I feel very strongly about voting. But my 18th birthday was in 2018. Trump was the president, and I think that when I talk to my friends and some of my friends who are registered Democrats and take issues very seriously and feel very passionate about issues like abortion and climate change and all of these things, I think back to when we became registered to vote, and I wonder, do you think that one of the unintended consequences of the Trump presidency is that people have lost all faith in the federal government? And although they feel very passionate about these issues, they feel like it doesn't matter who the president is, because even if there is a Democrat, right, like we put in 2020, the Supreme Court is still just going to make sure that it doesn't matter who the president is. And so they feel discouraged in that way. Is that something you've been seeing when you talk to young people?
Elements of it, yes, for sure. So it's funny. So one of the more interesting studies that I published was earlier this year, where we did a segmentation based upon attitudes of all young people between 18 and 30. Okay. And based upon the way in which they answered a couple dozen questions, we're able to, through statistical analysis, put them into one of 5 buckets. Okay. Based upon their likelihood to vote. You, Minnah, are clearly in the civic youth bucket, right? You and 15% of your generation, you vote, your friends vote, you help your friends register. That's 15%. That's amazing. I wish it was higher, right? But then we have this other 50%, okay, who are on the fence. One group I call Show Me, the other group I call Teach Me, okay? And this is exactly kind of your point. A lot of those, quote, show me voters who right now are kind of on this fence, should I or should I not vote, are asking questions like, I voted in 18, I voted in 20, I'm a young woman in Tennessee, and I lost my reproductive freedom, right? What does it, why should I bother to do this again? Okay. Those are questions that we hear often as one example. Or I voted, I thought we're going to have student debt relief. My debt isn't relieved. Well, they may not know that $170 billion of debt has been relieved, even though Republicans blocked it and so did the Supreme Court. There have been other ways with DOE and things that President Biden was able to do to see that so much of those loans have been forgiven. So there's an element of this which is kind of showing me that we need to continue to talk about the efficacy of voting and the difference that it makes. Ironically, I do think 2018, one of the drivers of participation was what Trump was actually doing, right? It did make a difference because he was in office, walls were going up, people were prevented from coming into the country, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. So, but so much of this gets to helping young people see the tangible difference that participation makes.
Mm-hmm.
Oh, yeah, along those lines, you mentioned that abortion rights, women's health care, immigration are kind of motivating messages for youth voters. But I feel like one of the central themes of the Harris campaign is this kind of battle for the soul of democracy. This, Trump represents this existential threat. How much does that resonate with Gen Z compared to maybe other generations? I'm just curious how much that message is landing.
Yeah, I think to broaden out for the Harris campaign, it is democracy, but it's really a fundamental fight for your freedom, right, and freedoms, and that is something that has been a recurring theme in our polling for years, well before Roe v. Wade was overturned. There was deep concern about lack of potential losing access to clean air, clean water over time, access to health care, access to quality education, regardless of where you live, freedom of feeling safe and secure when you're in a public school or a public space. So the idea of fighting for freedoms, maintaining what we have and expanding what we have, I think is central to how young people think about politics. They may not. I think that language is more resonant than democracy. A lot of young people say they question whether democracy works, right? Because they would tell me, if David Hogg, my friend, reminds me, he says, if democracy is working, why are children being slaughtered in school on a regular basis, right? So that's kind of how young people think about it. But I think her framing of fighting for basic freedoms is something that is deeply resonant with younger people.
And when we talk about like different issues that either will or won't get young people out to the voting booths, what do you think about foreign policy? I definitely think that the war in the Middle East and the Gaza issue has really made young people feel disenfranchised when it comes to voting for people and what their vote is going towards. Do you think that foreign policy is going to have a greater impact on youth turnout than domestic issues in this election? And is that different than, normal election years?
I've been fine-tuning all of my research to try to answer that question, obviously, for not just the last year, but, for the last several years, post-Afghanistan withdrawal as an example. But while foreign policy, Israel, Gaza, Hamas, Russia, Ukraine, Iran, all very, very important. That pales in comparison to the two big concerns that I hear when I talk to young voters who are committed to voting, young voters who who I hope vote are kind of on the fence, the level of concern they have about their financial health is striking, and I think that really drowns out most other issues for most folks. I meet just a tremendous number of people by proportion in my focus groups who have already told me they have been, they are, or on the verge, about a month of being homeless. Cost of living, the idea of something, even a modest American dream, is something that young people really are concerned about ever attaining, and that really kind of drowns out most of those other issues. Not that young people don't care, not that young people don't think they're important. That's what's kind of driving, I think, how they think about politics today. And of course, not too far behind, especially with women, it's actually in many cases more important, is access to abortion, reproductive health care, and those sorts of things. So those to me are the driving forces.
Shifting focus a little bit, one of the kind of ever-present threats, I suppose, maybe a bit harsh to call them this, but is the third parties. While we've seen RFK Jr. drop out, we still have people like Jill Stein in the race. And as we saw in 2016, the votes that she got could have made the difference in some of these key states. Is Gen Z more likely to be kind of swayed over to the side of voting third party? Speaking completely anecdotally from my experience, I know a lot of people that, especially on the Gaza issue, are angry with the Democrats. They're still not willing to vote for Trump, but they might cast a vote for somebody like Jill Stein. Or I know young conservatives who won't vote for Trump, but they can't bring themselves to vote for Kamala Harris, so they're looking for some other option to vote for. Is Gen Z more likely to vote third party than older generations, or is this something that we've kind of gotten a bit wiser to?
Well, that could be the answer to this question, right? Could really I think determine the outcome of the election, and certainly in a place like Michigan. Bobby Kennedy had certainly been over-indexing, doing extremely well with younger people throughout his campaign until that ended. I think they are I would say that younger people seem slightly more open to independent third party candidates, but as we get closer, we always have to be concerned about that in terms of the difference that it can make in the election. But I do feel like younger people, by and large, are kind of becoming wiser and appreciate the value of their vote and seem more intent than I recall in previous elections to vote for one of the two major party candidates, especially in the battleground states. It's not to say that Stein, won't, benefit from some independent-minded young people going her way over Gaza or something. But in terms of attitudes, I feel like younger people, especially in those battleground states, understand their value of their vote, and they would tell pollsters one thing, tell me in focus groups one thing in the spring and the summer, but in the final days, I think it's more likely than not, that the Stein and the independent candidates continue to winnow their support away.
Yeah, and personally speaking, I mentioned my anecdotes of people I know who are being swayed by third party, but on the flip side, I remember 2016, 2020, so many people, especially in the Bernie camp, felt really burned, rightfully or wrongly, about how the primary went down, and how many of them were talking about how they couldn't vote for Democrats. And I see a lot less of that kind of narrative this time around, where there seems to be so much more enthusiasm around the Democratic candidate. And, part of that's just because I think of the way the primary process happened. There wasn't that room to kind of alienate the camp for one of the candidates. So I wonder if that maybe plays a role. But certainly, just from who I talk to, I definitely agree that it seems like there's a lot more kind of coalescing around the Democratic candidate, which is heartening to hear.
Just shifting a tiny bit over to how young people are influenced to get to their ballot and cast their vote. I have heard a lot of discourse recently about celebrity endorsements. I'm sure everybody has heard this discourse. Who's Taylor Swift endorsing? Who's Beyonce endorsing? Is she going to endorse? And I know that the Taylor Swift endorsement saw a huge bump in voter registration. And I also have been hearing amongst my friends, like lots of chatter about Chapel Roan and who's she endorsing and why isn't she endorsing anybody. And I feel like this election specifically, I have heard way more about celebrities and who they're putting their vote behind and how do people feel about that, and do they care if Chapel Roan endorses somebody or not. And anyways, I guess all of this backstory is to ask the question, do you think that in this election celebrity endorsements have greater impact on the youth vote than what the actual candidates are saying, or what other politicians are endorsing, like the Cheneys, for example? Like, do you think that the celebrity endorsement has a bigger impact on this election than in other elections? And why do you think that is, that we're turning to celebrities in 2024?
It's interesting. Yeah, I don't know necessarily if there's more like celebrity chatter around endorsements than in the past. I don't know about that. I mean, I remember, the early Rock the Vote campaigns, when I feel like you had many more, entertainers and musicians and artists, endorsing certain candidates, but they might have more impact today. Okay. Because you can measure the impact within hours, right? Within 24 hours, hundreds of thousands of young people registered to vote, when Taylor Swift endorsed Kamala Harris, a handful of weeks ago. So I do think that they perhaps have more direct impact, and it's really about not necessarily about persuasion. I think it's about like concerts, right? To bring people together to register, right? Friends, right? When people see themselves represented in someone that they admire, and then their friends are also voting, that makes them more likely to register to vote and to participate. So that's one element. The other element of celebrity is like the influencers that I think Trump has been building relationships with over years, right? Dave Portnoy from Barstool Sports, Andrew Schultz's podcast, The Yvonne, Dana White, right? These are, celebrity, and Elon Musk, folks. So I think what we're seeing, perhaps Republicans, who used to only have like Kid Rock, Ted Nugent, to kind of expanding their suite of folks who can influence certain pockets within the electorate, right? I do think that the Cheneys can give some permission, right, to Gen X or Boomer, independent-minded, suburban voters, right, who care about pocketbook issues, who can maybe give them some permission to consider the bigger picture. But I think that that it's been interesting to see the role that influencers have played across the entire age cohort and ideological spectrum.
Minnah, I know Minnah has one more quick question, then I'll have a final wrap-up question.
Oh, sorry. I didn't know you wanted me to ask it now. My last question that I wanted to ask you about was about an article that I read that made me super angry. And that article was about how some states were making it harder for students in college to actually vote, harder to get to polling places, not letting polling places open up on campuses or near campuses. And I know that made me furious because I remember, in 2020 when there were all of these restrictions on voting by mail and Republicans were trying to make it harder for people to vote or more confusing for people to vote. So they would just get disenfranchised and not put in a vote in 2020. And that definitely mobilized me. I mean, I was going to vote regardless, but I became very excited about making sure, because I'm from Florida. And so there's lots of old people who were confused about voting by mail. mail. And I wanted to make sure that old people had information so that they could vote by mail. And I'm wondering if you think that these limitations to voting in college are going to have a similar effect. Do you think that young people are going to be discouraged and be like, oh, well, it's too hard, I'm not doing it? Or do you think they're going to be like this, similarly to how young people felt in 2020, where it's like, if you are going to make it hard, if you don't want me to do this, it's going to make me want to do it more?
Yeah, we have to continually be concerned about that. I think the good news is, Minnah, that there's been continue to be a lot of investment in organizing college campuses. From independent minded groups to do two things, right? To remind young people about the importance of voting, the attitudinal barriers I talked about, but also find ways to get ballots to them, right? To overcome the barriers that states like New Hampshire, I believe, in Texas and other places are putting in place to kind of prevent them the rights to kind of cast that ballot. So yes, Republican state legislatures continue to put up barriers, but thankfully there's been a tremendous amount, I think, of work done to try to overcome those barriers. But it's a constant battle. It's a constant battle. But younger people, thankfully, have been overcoming them, and they've been voting at rates in which other generations have not. And I think that's testament to how important these issues are today.
Well, we're about out of time, but I do want to ask one last question. And, it's partially because I want some advice, but it's a bit of a two-parter. Now that we're in the final stretch, what do you see as the biggest opportunities for the Harris camp to improve their outreach to youth voters? But also on a more personal level, what are the best ways you've seen that Gen Z, like I know I don't look Gen Z, but me and Minnah are, that we can reach out to our peers to get them to vote? What are the biggest opportunities for everybody to kind of do their part to get people out to vote?
Yeah, I think number one advice for you is to kind of reach out to your friends, from high school, for college, and throughout your network, and just remind them of the difference it made, right? Remind them that I think we live in a better, different place because of young voters. Many people don't realize, as much as we have this divide, we live in a divided country, 50-50 it is, but it's really divided based upon age and generation, right? Gen Z and millennials, your generation, have a set of values that are reflected in this election and Kamala Harris's campaign. Without putting like exorbitant amount of pressure, the degree to which younger people vote, it's a critical component to her campaign, right? So showing the difference that young people have made and will continue to make on a host of issues. That's my advice for all people who care about turning out and encouraging young people to participate. I think that there are three things that the Harris campaign needs to do in the final weeks, to shore up support among young people. Three things, kind of like three legs on a stool. I think one thing is, I think they need to remind people who are young voters, who are 10, 12 years old when they were first introduced to Donald Trump. They were children, right? I think they need to remind him of his priorities relative to their priorities. And his priorities are certainly around focusing on helping the wealthy compared to the working class. I think that's an important piece that young people in the battleground states need to continue to hear. One. Number two, I think that there's a cohort of younger people on the fence who need to feel very confident that voting for Kamala Harris is voting in their own financial interests, and that she would improve their job prospects, reduce the cost of living, and provide them a pathway to the American dream. Economic messaging. Two, and then the third thing is continue to pay attention to that left flank, to the kind of the progressive base who is deeply concerned about important issues like access to healthcare, reproductive healthcare, mental health care, those sorts of things. So those, I think, are the three pieces that how young people are making their decisions. And I think it's critically important that Harris and folks who are supporting her campaign continue to message those 3 points.
Sounds like fantastic advice to me. Unfortunately, we are just about out of time, so I will have to say thank you so much, John, for joining us. We really appreciate it. And
it is great to be with you guys.
And I appreciate your patience with us as we take the reins for our first time on the main DSR. Hopefully, to all the listeners, you still enjoy the episode in the absence of David's incredible wit. But David will be back. Fear not. We will have a Scylla Consciousness coming out tomorrow. And of course, the rest of our programming across the DSR network. So stay tuned for that. Until then, thank you for joining us, and bye-bye.